Hi. I kind of want to get back to basics with this one. I don't want to speak too loudly because it's the early hours of the morning, but I think it's very important. And I say back to basics because it's back to the basic argument of the whole George Floyd protests, which I think have really taken a turn into a whole other realm about. Look, okay, racism might be a factor, but it's getting now into colonialism and history, and it's just totally morphed into something else completely, or at least well beyond the original situation. So back to basics, I want to talk about the basic subject. I'm not saying it's simple, but the basic subject of police power and police brutality and police accountability. These issues are extremely important. Um, friend just posted an article, a link by the well-known Sheriff D. Clarke. Um, well, rather, she posted a link by Sean Furlong, who was posting a quotation by Sheriff D. Clarke. So I'll read this out. It's not massively long. This is the whole piece, so I'm not editing anything here. This is from Sean Furlong, the 20th of June. I don't know who Sean Furlong is, but that's who it's from. Sheriff D. Clarke says it best. It's not the police who need to be retrained, it's the public. We've grown into a mouthy, mobile phone wielding vulgar on civil society with no personal responsibility and the attitude of it's the other person's fault. You owe me. A society where children grow up with no boundaries or knowledge or concern for civil society and personal responsibility. When an officer says put your hands up, then put your hands up. Don't reach for something in your pocket, your lap, your seat. There's plenty of reason for a police officer to feel threatened. There have been multiple assaults and ambushes on police officers lately. Comply with requests from the officer, have your day in court. Don't mouth off or fight or refuse to comply. That escalates the situation. Police officers are our sons and daughters, fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters. They're black, white, brown, all colours, all ethnicities, all faiths, male and female. They are us. They see the worst side of humanity, the raped children, the bloody mangled bodies of traffic victims, the bruised and battered victims of domestic violence, homicide victims' body parts, day after day. They work holidays while we have festive meals with our families. They miss school events with their kids, birthdays, anniversaries, all those special occasions that we take for granted. They work in all kinds of weather under dangerous conditions for relatively low pay. They have extensive training, but they are human. When there are numerous attacks on them, they become hyper-vigilant for a reason. They have become targets. When a police officer encounters any person, whether at a traffic stop, a street confrontation, an arrest, whatever, that situation has the potential to become life-threatening. You, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Civilian, misread that, also have the responsibility of keeping the situation from getting out of control. Many law enforcement officers are veterans. They've been in service to this nation most of their lives, whether on the battlefield or protecting us here at home. They're the only thing that stands between us and anarchy in the streets. If you want to protect your child, teach them respect. Um, Let me just say from the outset, this is far too overly simplistic. And there's a lot of talking points with that. Um, I am familiar with Clark. I've seen him quoted many times. He's back, incidentally, if you don't know. So he's often been held up by conservatives to sort of say, well, look, this black officer is putting the anarchists in their place. Here's the problem, certainly with that take. It's far too biased. Um, Based on that take, he isn't even trying to understand the anger. Um, it's just far too simple to say, oh, it's just a lack of respect in society that, that's why the problems are as they are. A lot of the things he says is factually true. Police officers do face real danger. They face enormous pressures. Their pay isn't wonderful. Um, and of course, they come from all backgrounds and they're only human. That's all true. But I think what he's overlooking, badly overlooking, is the very real perception And it's a perception that is based on too many examples of reality that police officers are not held to account when they do abuse their power, not sufficiently held to account. I mean, what happened to in the George Floyd situation, I think got so much attention because it was filmed. Same with the Eric Garner situation. Um, those were filmed, so it makes you wonder how many similar cases weren't filmed. Um, one of the areas where I differ with Black Lives Matter or take issue with Black Lives Matter is they put the whole focus on black victims. There has been white victims as well, and Asian and Hispanic victims of police brutality. The problem with Sheriff Clarke is he's a police officer, and unlike other officers, he is totally coming into this debate with an attitude of um, the police are entirely the victims. Um, I don't think it's a good enough argument to say, oh, well, we're human, so don't judge us too harshly. Well, everyone is human. Having a pressurizing job isn't an excuse to abuse power. I mean, officers sign up to that job knowing that there are dangers involved. Um, it's an enormous amount of responsibility and it's very admirable. I think I think that a lot of people have been holding up attitudes like this from certain officers in law enforcement as somehow, oh, it's this simple. It really, really isn't. What Sheriff Clarke is ignoring is there have been clear abuses of power. Um, Certainly, when a suspect is unarmed, they end up dead. There is no rational justification for that. Even if they are resisting arrest, yes, it might escalate the situation. Yes, it doesn't help. But there is no excuse for what Derek Chauvin done to George Floyd. There just isn't. Whatever way you gloss it over. That's why that incident angered so many people. Um, so I find there are certain people on the conservative side of things are far, far too quick to make excuses for the police. And there's too many people within police departments. Sometimes it's in the form of unions, sometimes it's in the form of high profile officers like Sheriff Clarke, who seem to have blinkers on to the fact that abuse does happen. Now, this just gives a perception that they're only interested in protecting their own, and you'd expect that. I mean, if you're working with colleagues for years on end and you know the pressures they face, naturally you're going to have empathy with them. Um, but the problem is a failure of dialogue and just dismissing everything on society um, won't solve the problem any more than anarchists and looters will. He makes a lot of fair points. There is a blame culture. There are too many young people on both sides of the Atlantic who grow up without respect. And if you are, if a police officer is asking a reasonable request to comply and you're being deliberately obstructionist, just mouthing off and refusing to comply, obviously it isn't going to help matters. So that's a valid point. But I think he is grossly overlooking the abuse side of things. He didn't even mention it in this take. I haven't seen all the speeches. Maybe he has mentioned it on other occasions. I don't know. But this is being held up as, he speaks the truth and it's all, let's listen to this guy. Well, no, because he's very biased. I don't think he's particularly offering any solutions. He's just basically saying, "Oh well, if you just comply, there'll never be any problems. Let's just ignore corruption in the police. Let's just ignore officers that do abuse of power." Um, I think training is legitimate when you have police officers who are disregarding their own department's regulations, as has been the case with the NYPD. So I think that echoes too much of excuses. It echoes too much of just trying to shift the blame. Um, that doesn't mean that I think that police are only to blame. Of course not. I mean, One problem with the current state of protests is it means that when officers do apprehend violent suspects or dangerous suspects, then Black Lives Matter is going to scream racism every time it's a black suspect, which is clearly nonsense. And it's also clearly reckless because it means that police might even be in a situation where they're reluctant to tackle crime because they don't want to be accused of racism or because they don't want to get into the situations that Derek Chauvin is in. And I'm not saying that was his own making, but they'll be looking at that. They'll be looking at the worldwide reaction to that, and it might now mean a situation where the police actually aren't enforcing the law. That's really problematic. So I'm very sympathetic to the pressures that police officers face, and I think that the public needs to be understanding of that. But I also think that if nothing is learnt from all of this, it would be an utter travesty. Um, and I think Sheriff Clarke is not really helping matters by refusing ostensibly to even consider the other side of the argument. The fact that there is corruption, the fact that there is abuse of power, and on too many occasions, it has simply resulted in an officer being put on desk duty. That's not good enough. Um, facing pressurizing situations, facing danger, or officers being veterans, none of those things justify abuse of power. They just don't. Um, but the other side of it is the public also need to, and the protesters need to understand that there are also many cases where suspects don't comply, and that doesn't help matters. I mean, an officer has a right to protect himself, an officer or herself has a right to feel, officers have died in the line of duty. There was the attack on the Dallas Police Department a few years ago, 5 officers killed. And that was just a high profile case. There's many other examples of officers dying in the line of duty, and it needs to be understood. One of the worst incidents in Britain was the murder of PC Keith Blakelock during the Broadwater Farm riots in Tottenham in North London in 1985. He was actually from Sunderland, so that's why I know of the case. Um, and he was beaten to death, basically beaten to death by a mob in the line of duty because the anger had just exploded over because some black citizens had been shot by the police, and it really escalated. But there needs to be dialogue, and that means both sides listening. The protesters need to understand that they cannot just portray every single situation as racist. That isn't going to help the police, because it's not true. And they need to recognize that there are situations where violent criminals are not complying with basic requests. On the other hand, the police, for their part, need to accept that there is a very, very strong perception of double standards and lack of accountability, not with the George Floyd case, because Derek Chauvin is facing trial, but in too many other examples, it's basically been let's protect our own, let's put them on desk duty, pending inquiry. Now, if you've lost a loved one to police violence, that is inevitably going to make you feel there's been a utter lack of justice and accountability. So, so important that there is understanding on both sides. I'm not saying, by the way, the police should just negotiate with people who are rioting. That is not what I'm saying. The police need to have the power to impose the law. They're law enforcement, right? But they also have responsibility not to abuse that power because otherwise you end up with a police state. So the concluding part of that take was otherwise we'll have anarchy. Well, yeah, anarchy is one extreme, but a police state is the other. Um, so anyway, those are just some things to think about.